1944, in the ruins of wartime Italy, elite German troops are on a special mission.
We saw people beaten up, killed. They just shot them.
They have been sent by Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Nazis' murderous SS, to seize a precious treasure before Italy falls into Allied hands. They're searching for what has been called the Bible for the Aryan race, a book which will justify the most horrific policies of Nazi Germany.
It gives an academic justification to the idea of a difference between peoples.
This is what our ancestors used to be like, pure and unlike any other people.
Once you create the idea that some races are inferior, then you've got a legitimacy to start murdering people, by the race load.
The book is so important that Himmler will stop at nothing to get it. This is the true story of the Nazi quest for the Book of Power. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler took office as the Chancellor of Germany. But his hold on power was not as secure as it seemed. The Nazis had won less than half the popular vote. The nation was divided, and he needed to unite it.
You've got, in the middle of the 20th century, a country that only really exists as a concept because it was, until just a few years before, in real terms, just a collection of very, very small states. How do you unite these people? Well, the way to unite them is to create a mythology.
The myth that the Nazis hoped could unite the German people was the idea that they were descended from a race superior to all others, the Aryans. The Nazis claimed that the Aryans had originated from Atlantis, the mythical city first described by Plato as the birthplace of all civilization. They claimed that in prehistoric times, these Aryans had settled on the North German plains. They were said to be a race of tall, flaxen-haired warriors who uniquely possessed the genius to create civilization. Hitler believed that the German people were descended directly from these superhumans.
There is this need in the Nazis to demonstrate that they were a kind of cradle of civilization, that they'd been there for a long, long time.
The Nazis claimed that before the ancient Greeks and Romans were ruling the Mediterranean, the ancestors of the Germans had already spawned a great northern European civilization.
There does seem to be a tendency to want to endorse your current position in the world by taking your history as far back as it can go to show that you got there first. Perhaps you're more advanced, perhaps you're more legitimate to be in this role.
This Aryan myth was the one the Nazis believed could rally the German people to their banner.
Everything has to tie back to promote the idea that the Germans are the best, quote, race in the world.
But the fly in the ointment was that there was no proof that this master race had ever existed. But an ancient manuscript was said to exist which supported the Nazis' ideas. It told of a people who lived in Germany thousands of years before, and the Nazis believed that this book would prove all their theories to be true. It was called the Germania and was written in Rome nearly 2,000 years before. In the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire was reaching its height, stretching from Africa and the Mediterranean to the lands of the Britons. But the Germania told of a group of people in the north of mainland Europe who even the Romans could not quell. A people called the Germanen. In 9 AD, one of Rome's most famous generals, Quintilius Varus, led an army of 3 legions to conquer the Germanen. Under their fierce warrior king, Hermann, the Germanen tribes came face to face with the Romans in the Teutoburg forests. There, they dealt the mighty empire a devastating blow. All 3 Roman legions were wiped out.
Germany for the Romans was a very emotive place precisely because of this disaster in AD 9, where this general Quintilius Varus lost these 3 legions.
So great was the disaster, the Roman Emperor Augustus conceded that the Germanen were just too ferocious to be quelled.
Augustus decided that Germany should not be pushed further as a conquest. And that was a very powerful message to send out to subsequent emperors. It's daunting, it's forbidding.
The Nazis claimed that the modern Germans were the direct descendants of King Hermann's fearsome warriors. They also believed that the book, the Germania, held written proof of the superiority of their ancestors. The fabled Germania was written not by a German, but by the Roman senator and orator Cornelius Tacitus around the year 98 AD.
He was one of the most accomplished speakers of his generation, and he had an exemplary political career. He even became a consul and became what many people believe is the greatest Roman historian.
Tacitus wrote at the time of the most decadent period in Roman history. His works describe every sordid detail of the reigns of Rome's leaders, the Emperor Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. But for the Germanen, Tacitus was apparently full of praise.
He says that no other nation, no other group of people had troubled the Romans so much as the Germans with their strong sense of liberty.
In the book, the Germania, Tacitus describes in admiring detail the culture of the Germanen tribes, the gods they worship, how they select their kings, what weapons they use in battle, and their custom of fiercely training their youth as warriors.
Their characteristics are very much, I think, put on a pedestal as qualities that Romans actually admire. For example, their chastity and their simplicity in terms of not being interested in money, in profit, and that sort of thing.
No one in Germany laughs at vice, nor do they call it the fashion to corrupt and to be corrupted. They choose their kings by birth, their generals by merit. No nation indulges more profusely in entertainments and hospitality.
Tacitus's descriptions appeared to match the image of their ancestors that the Nazis were keen to promote to the German people.
You're presented with idealized native types who have a certain kind of purity about them and go about things in a very different way from Romans.
There's this whole tradition of reading the Germania as if it were a glorification of the noble savage.
More than that, Tacitus describes the physical characteristics of these mighty Germans. He wrote about how they had fierce blue eyes, blonde hair, and huge frames. In short, they were perfect Aryans. For the Nazis, the Germania was proof that the German people were descended from a mighty race superior to all others, and provided a direct link to their Aryan origins. And the words of Tacitus would resonate with one German in particular. In 1924, a young failed chicken farmer called Heinrich Himmler read the Germania on a long train journey and would be inspired by the words of Tacitus.
There he found, written by a Roman historian 2,000 years before, many of the things that he already believed in, so he basically found them confirmed.
After reading the Germania, the young Himmler confided to his diary,
I was lost in the glorious image of the loftiness, purity, and nobleness of our ancestors.
He wrote down in his diary that he hoped that the Germans would be so again, so it had a huge impact on him.
Himmler would go on to become one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany.
Throughout the 1930s, Himmler becomes a very, very key figure in the Third Reich. He's a very underrated figure because he's quiet and unassuming. He looks quite bookish with his little glasses and his short hair, and he's a former chicken farmer, and obviously that's quite funny. But actually, don't underestimate Heinrich Himmler. This is a man, throughout the whole arc of the Nazi regime, is a man who grabs power little by little.
Himmler rose to be head of the SS, a fearsome paramilitary organization which controlled much of the Nazi state. And Himmler would shape his SS in the image of the warrior race described in the Germania.
One could in many ways say that what he promised himself in his diary in 1924, he would then try to live up to as the leader of the SS. He himself conceived of the SS as the vanguard of the future Germanic Empire.
But more than that, Himmler believed the words of Tacitus didn't just have lessons for the SS, but for all true Germans.
The Germania by Tacitus is referred to as a Bible that every thinking German should possess, because people should aspire to be as morally elevated, straightforward, honorable, direct, and brave as their Germanic ancestors allegedly had been.
Himmler wanted the Nazi state to be a reflection of the ancient German society described by Tacitus. Just as in the Germania, children were taught to swear loyalty to their leader, in this case, Adolf Hitler.
The chief fights for victory. His vassals fight for their chief.
Students were taught to be like their warrior forefathers, even wrestling and exercising with weapons.
Naked youths dance amid swords and lances that threaten their lives. Experience gives them skill, and skill again gives grace.
The Honor Cross was awarded to women who bore many children, as this was something much admired in Germanic society.
The offspring reproduced the strength of the parents.
And in the policy of Lebensraum, German people were told that the lands of neighboring countries, which had once been the home of ancient Germanic tribes, were rightfully theirs. But beyond even that, Himmler would use Tacitus to justify the most evil of all Nazi policies. In 1935, the Nazis implemented the first of many racial laws. Called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor, it was an ominous first step in the Nazis' anti-Jewish policies.
It prohibits marriages between Aryan Germans and Jewish Germans.
And it was based on one paragraph of the Germania.
Key line in Germania is when Tacitus writes that the Germans are a people unto themselves, the implication being that there's no breeding with any other race or with any other people. They're a homogeneous group of people.
Tacitus said they hadn't mixed with other people. So not only were they indigenous, but they were pure and unlike any other people.
The Nazis were using the words of Tacitus to justify policies which would unleash an unimaginable terror on the world.
It gives an academic justification to the idea of a difference between peoples. And once you create the idea that some races are inferior, you then create the idea that some lives are worth less than others. And once you create that idea, then you've got a legitimacy to start murdering people, by the race load.
In other words, there is a direct link between their interpretation of the Germania and the Nazi death camps. Because of their understanding of Tacitus, over 11 million people would be murdered in the Nazi genocide.
That's how disastrously influential that particular paragraph was.
So important was this book to Nazi ideology that Himmler desperately wanted the authentic text. The trouble was that no one knew what had happened to Tacitus's original manuscript. So to find it, Himmler turned to one of the strangest and most sinister branches of the SS. It was known as the Ahnenerbe and had been created by Himmler in 1935. Unlike the Germanic warriors who made up the rest of the SS, the Ahnenerbe was an institution made up of academics.
If you want the classic example of how the Nazis manipulated intellectualism and academic behavior, you can go no further than look at the Ahnenerbe. This was an institution set up ultimately by Himmler to research, quote-unquote, German ancestry. And it was to look at how you could construct a mythology of Aryanism and Germanic culture.
The Ahnenerbe were charged with rewriting history to help Himmler to prove that the Aryan Germanic people were superior to all other races.
The Studienstiftung Ahnenerbe. There were genuine intellectuals and researchers and scientists working side by side with real cranks.
And there were around 100 academics of various different sorts working there. You had a support staff of about the same size. So you've got about 200 people. And the Ahnenerbe can't just be seen as a kind of harmless bunch of corrupted academics who were just sucking up to the Nazis. Because what they were proving was helping to create a worldview that was in essence evil.
On Himmler's orders, the Ahnenerbe began to search for Tacitus's lost manuscript. Immediately, they encountered a problem. Tacitus's original no longer existed. In the collapse of the Roman Empire and the ensuing centuries of the Dark Ages, many precious documents were lost. But a glimmer of hope remained. The Ahnenerbe discovered that the manuscript had escaped the fires of Rome. And at some point in history, a single perfect copy of the original text had been made. But this too was missing.
Well, the survival of classical texts is often a very, very random and hazardous business. The fact that we can read the Germania today dates back to the fact that there was this one manuscript which was copied.
It was said that a traveling Italian scholar had made this beautiful word-for-word copy of the Germania in a monastery in southern Germany in the mid-15th century. This copy of the Germania became known as the Aesinas Codex.
And that's the copy that Heinrich Himmler was trying to get his hands on. Because it's as close as you can get to the written account of the Germanic past.
The Ahnenerbe immediately began hunting down the Aesinas Codex. They scoured the world in their search. And eventually they brought some good news to Himmler. In 1936, they reported that the book he so desperately wanted had been found. The Aesinas Codex had been traced to the east of Italy. For 200 years it had lain in obscurity in the vast private library of an Italian count. The Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani.
My father was Conte Aurelio Baldeschi Guglielmi Baleani. In Italy, it's a very important title.
My father had 3 houses. One is this villa where we are now. The other one is a palace in Osimo. And the other is the palace in Iesi.
The Codex Aesinas was stored in the library that they had in the Palazzo in Iesi. People had simply forgotten about it.
The Count's libraries contained many other important documents, such as the letters of Casanova and writings by Cicero.
So it's fairly easy to see how it would get overlooked.
As a result, Count Aurelio Baldeschi Baliani was completely unaware of how important the Aesinas Codex was to the Nazis.
Tacitus or Aesinos Codex was the most important book to Germany. We really never realized it was such an important thing.
It was in this library of the family, and it was not really, nobody knew how important it was.
But soon that would change.
Prima di tutto l'agricoltura, che deve trovare sbocchi per i prodotti ubertosi delle vostre terre.
In 1936, Italy was ruled over by Benito Mussolini. Like Hitler, he was another fascist leader. This brutal, populist politician had seized control of Italy in a coup d'etat in 1922 and declared himself Il Duce, the leader. And since coming to power, Hitler, the German Führer, had been carefully courting his Italian counterpart. Now, on Himmler's request, Hitler petitioned the Italian dictator to obtain the manuscript and present it to the Nazi state. It seemed that Mussolini was more than happy to oblige.
Mussolini thought, well, if Hitler wants this book very badly, it's a good idea to give it to him, to try and take it from the family.
Himmler was convinced that it was only a matter of time before he would have it in his grasp. He planned a triumphant return for the Germania at the 1936 Nazi Party convention, where hundreds of thousands of party members would be in attendance. An enormous Germanic room was built with huge panels featuring quotes from Tacitus, and above the door was a quotation from Hitler himself.
German youth shall know, manly loyalty was the virtue of the old Germanen. The new state is erected upon that virtue.
But Himmler hadn't reckoned on the stubbornness of the Count Baldeschi-Balliani. An emissary from Mussolini's government was sent to meet the Count at his villa to request him to give up the Asinus Codex. But the Count Aurelio Baldeschi-Balliani was not used to being bossed around.
Mussolini wanted to give it to Hitler as a present, but my father actually didn't like fascism. He didn't like Mussolini.
The Count thought Mussolini was ridiculous, and he had no time for the pompous upstart's demands. So he refused to hand over the book.
He didn't want to make Mussolini too happy. He didn't want to make Hitler happy. I mean, he didn't want to give it away.
I was always proud of my father for everything. Just to say no and just to be very nonchalant about it. I think that demonstrates courage and intelligence.
Himmler was infuriated by Mussolini's failure. To make matters worse, his best hope of getting the book, Hitler, was losing interest in Himmler's obsessions.
Adolf Hitler had, in private conversations on more than one occasion, only snide comments to make. He couldn't quite see what these scholar types, so fascinated with the Germanic past, actually had to contribute to the rise of, the German state.
Himmler liked surrounding himself with all this mythology, whereas Hitler thought this was going all a little bit too far. He saw it as being unnecessary. To him, it was about politics and power.
But Himmler refused to give up. He continued to put pressure on the Baldeschi-Ballianis, sending his own emissaries to meet with the Count.
The interest in the book was very, very, very strong, and so they made several attempts to try and take this book from us.
Finally, after 2 years of mounting pressure, Count Aurelio made a concession. The Germans couldn't have the book, but they could at least have a look at it. Just before the outbreak of the war, the Count packed up the book and sent it to Rome, where it would be photographed for Himmler. In Rome, it was presented to Himmler's emissary.
A member of Ahnenerbe, Rudolf Till, was given access to the Codex Aesinas in Italy, and he was able to produce a set of photographs.
The Ahnenerbe used these photographs to produce a Nazi edition of the Aesinas Codex. Himmler even wrote the foreword himself.
The future will only be granted to those who understand the stock of their ancestry.
But for Himmler, even this was not enough. All he had was a facsimile. He was determined to possess the original. And one day, he would have the chance to take it. In 1939, Hitler plunged the world into war. Under Mussolini, Italy was Germany's most important ally. The two dictators eventually found themselves fighting both the Western powers and Russia. After 4 bloody years, the tide of the war turned against the fascist nations. In 1943, Allied forces landed in the south of Italy. Benito Mussolini was overthrown by an Italian revolt, and Italy switched its allegiance to the Allies. To shore up his southern flank, Hitler was forced to send German troops into Italy. Himmler now saw an opportunity to seize the Asinus Codex from the Baldeschi-Balliani family. So with the German advance, Himmler now sent an entire unit of his own SS troops to the region, with the express purpose of tracking the book down. But where was it? The Baldeschi-Ballianis had 3 properties: 2 town palazzi and a country villa. The book could be in any one of them, or none of them. First, Himmler's soldiers were sent to the Balliani's main residence, his villa outside the town of Jesi.
After Mussolini was dead, at the end, the Germans came looking themselves for the book.
But they found the villa empty. Days before, the Count had moved his family out of the villa to one of his other properties to protect them. But Himmler's troops did discover one thing. The Count's servants had taken everything of value from the villa to another of his properties, his palazzo in the town of Jesi, only a few miles away. The Count's treasures had been smuggled out in agricultural carts, hidden from the Germans beneath piles of farm produce.
There were many cars that were going at that time in the center of the town of Jesi, so lots of things were hidden under the wheat and under the grapes.
Could it be that the Asinus Codex was among the valuables? So now Himmler's troops rushed to the palazzo in Jesi.
They asked for the book in a very aggressive way. And also here, the waiters and the chauffeurs and all the people working in the house, maybe pretending they didn't understand the language, maybe risking also their life, because I mean, at those times, life was not so safe like can be today in this kind of situation.
But once again, Himmler's troops found nothing. Neither the Germania nor the Baldeschi family were in the villa at Jesi. Himmler's SS now turned their attentions to the third of the Count's properties, another palazzo 30 kilometers away in the town of Osimo.
My family, they all moved to Osimo. They moved there because they were thinking that it was more safe.
From their hiding place in Osimo, the Belleschi-Balianis witnessed the horrors of life under the Germans.
My brother and I used to look from the window and were very petrified because we saw people beaten up, killed. They just shot them. And so that was really a very, very horrible thing to see. And my parents didn't know we were seeing it, but I mean, children, you know, they climb up on a window and look down.
Eventually, Himmler's soldiers arrived at the palazzo itself.
It was all locked, the house.
They knocked at the door.
They were knocking at the door. I remember this very vividly, and I remember how scared we were that they could break down the door and take my father and kill him.
As the Germans searched the palazzo, the family hid in the cellars below.
I was 10 years old. My brother, one was 9, the other was even less. It was a terrible experience. We spent 18 days down in the cellars without ever coming up.
Himmler's soldiers scoured the house. But they never found the cellar door, and the Belleschi-Baliani family remained safe. So did the book. May the 8th, 1945 brought an end to 6 years of war in Europe. The Nazi dream of a 1,000-year Reich based on the foundations of an ancient Germanic culture had come to nothing. Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker. And Heinrich Himmler swallowed a cyanide capsule whilst in British custody.
This is the house in Lüneburg where Himmler committed suicide. In that room, the most despicable of all German criminals contrived to take poison.
With the war over, the truth about the elusive Assinas Codex would begin to emerge. Did this book really justify the Nazis' murderous policies? And anyway, where was it? One mystery was easily solved. The book had never moved from the first place that Himmler's troops had gone searching for it. The Baldeschi-Baliani's villa outside Jesi had a secret room.
This room has a false window. From the outside you see it, but in fact it's not a window that you can open.
The room with the false window had a hidden door, concealed by a wardrobe.
The door that was already a safety door by itself was also protected by furniture.
So that you could even see the door.
Behind the wardrobe and the hidden door sat a simple chest.
Inside this room there is this cassaforte, we say in Italian. Usually you keep laundry inside.
Concealed inside a pile of laundry lay the thing that had so obsessed Himmler. Tacitus's Germania. With the threat of the Nazis gone, the Baldeschi-Balianis no longer had to hide the book. The Italian government now recognized it as a national treasure, and the Baldeschi-Balianis would display it with pride in their library in Jesi for the next 20 years.
Every year, the Italian government sent some inspectors to see if the book was still with us, if it was well kept.
One year, the inspectors asked the Count to bring the book to Florence, as they couldn't make it to Jesi.
In 1966, they were in Florence, these inspectors, and they said, well, I'll take the book to Florence and I'll show you the book there.
The Count took the book to Florence in person, where he placed it in an underground bank vault overnight for safekeeping. The following day, he would take it to the inspectors. But then disaster.
That was the night of the flood in Florence.
November the 4th, 1966, saw the worst flooding in Florence's history. And water found what Himmler never could.
A flood came, and they weren't waterproof. So all the water with the gas, with the oil and paintings, they all went completely ruined.
This manuscript was ruined for the first 2 or 3 pages, and the last 2 or 3 pages, it was seriously damaged.
The first and the last pages were almost black. The writing looked like a negativa.
It looked as if this treasure had been destroyed forever. Months of costly and painstaking restoration followed, and the damage of the flooding was undone. Today, the Essenes Codex sits in the Biblioteca Nazionale in Rome. After nearly 200 years of holding the book, the Baldeschi-Baliani family had decided that the Essenes Codex should be available for all to see.
Little by little, we decided that this book was better if it was kept in a public place. And so then we gave it to the state, and it went to Rome, to the National Library in Rome.
Now that the oldest version of Tacitus's manuscript can be studied by experts from all nations, a very different picture of the ancient Germans than that promoted by Himmler has emerged. For a start, Tacitus was not as enraptured with the Germanen as Himmler had made out.
Tacitus attributes several clearly negative characteristics to the Germanic tribes. He basically speaks of their tendency towards drunkenness.
To pass an entire day and night in drinking disgraces no one. Their quarrels are seldom fought out with mere abuse, but commonly with wounds and bloodshed.
They were represented as liking their drink too much and having banquets, feasts during the day, this sort of thing.
They themselves lie buried in sloth, a strange combination in their nature that the same men should be so fond of idleness, so averse to peace.
He explicitly writes about their almost addiction to gambling. He also comments on what he describes as a form of laziness, basically.
They pass much of their time in idleness, giving themselves up to sleep and to feasting, the bravest and the most warlike doing nothing.
A sort of simple society, but one which has its flaws.
In fact, what Tacitus described was far from the perfect Aryan society claimed by Himmler.
In every household, the children, naked and filthy. They will be overcome by their own vices as easily as by the arms of an enemy.
It has become increasingly clear that the Ahnenerbe had only taken from Tacitus what they could use to support Himmler's theories of Germany's noble Aryan ancestors.
They blatantly misinterpreted, misread, and misquoted particular passages that didn't really fit their particular ideological view to make it fit their ideological view.
They've been highly selective. They've taken little bits of it, primarily around chapter 4, where he's talking about their racial purity, their blue eyes, their blonde hair, that sort of thing. And they've taken this work and very much, I think, made it what they want it to be.
And the Nazis had chosen to keep hidden another key fact about Tacitus. He had almost certainly never even seen any of the Germanen he was writing about, and had no real evidence for his statements about them. Some of his descriptions were plainly made up.
By the end of the monograph, you have this fantasy, bizarre sort of image of people with human faces but the bodies of animals. So it begins to enter the world of the fantastic. So you have to be wary of that when you're reading these texts.
Himmler also willfully ignored another fact. Modern-day Germans could not be the direct descendants of the Germanen.
The Nazis, in referring to the Germanic tribes, referred to them as ancient Germans or the old Germans. And that's exactly the kind of step that you must not make, because it is a simplification.
The Germani are different from the people that we would think of today as Germans. That's just the name that came to be used for the whole group of people.
They misidentified the German ancestors with the Germanic tribes that Tacitus describes, so you simply can't say that the Germanic tribes were the German ancestors.
The truth was that Hitler's Germans were descendants of many different peoples, not a single ancient tribe.
There was no German nation, and the whole tribal situation changed dramatically several times over the following centuries. So you can simply say, those are our ancestors.
But Himmler was unconcerned about the truth of what Tacitus really said, and the truth of the origins of the German people. He desired the Asinus Codex to help promote the vicious and racist policies of the Nazis. And the tragic fact is that even without ever laying his hands on the original, he was still able to use the words of Tacitus to aid the Nazis in their murderous policies, which resulted in the death of millions. In 1701, Captain Kidd was condemned as a pirate.
Arch-pirate and the common enemy of mankind.
But with his death, the mystery of Kidd's hidden treasure was born.
Kidd was the only one who actually buried his treasure.
Over the centuries, many adventurers have tried to find his hoard. No one tried harder than Englishman Richard Knight.
He got taken over by the ghost of Captain Kidd.
This is a tale of epic sea voyages, unimaginable riches lost, secret compartments found, hidden treasure maps where X marks the spot, clues to the buried millions.
And I said, "Have you really found it, Richard?" And he said, "Yes, I have."
But Knight's daring expedition lands him in a Vietnamese jail, fearing for his life. He risked everything to unearth Captain Kidd's legendary treasure. Richard Knight was an unlikely treasure hunter. He was born in a quiet English seaside town, but he was destined not to lead a conventional, quiet life.
He was a curious figure, Richard Knight. I mean, he was not like many people you meet these days. You may perhaps have met them in the 19th century, but I don't think you met them in the 20th century, and probably even less now.
Knight was a young man in the early 1960s when he moved to Paris. As a bon vivant, he enjoyed all that the city and the changing times had to offer.
He was an adventurer, a chancer. I think that he wanted to enjoy life. He wanted to have seen everything, experienced everything.
But Richard Knight was an entertainer, an actor. And he had come to Paris not just to have fun, but to study with the master of French mime, Marcel Marceau. He even had some success in his career. Knight played opposite the great Jacques Tati in his film comedy Playtime, as a confused drunk. But it seems he never settled anywhere for long.
He was happiest with the rucksack on his back. He was always footloose and fancy-free.
By 1978, Knight had travelled to Hollywood in an attempt to further his career as an actor. He never imagined his life was about to be given an entirely new direction. Not by a casting director, but by the actions of a man 300 years earlier. Captain William Kidd.
Suddenly he was inhabited by the ghost of Captain Kidd, another chancer from a much earlier century. And that's what I think happened to Richard. He got obsessed by the ghost of Captain Kidd.
Richard Knight was a voracious reader, and the books in the UCLA library drew him deeper and deeper into the extraordinary story of the infamous pirate. A tale of hardship and ill fortune, full of surprises.
Kidd was born in Dundee on the east coast of Scotland around 1655, but he went to New York, and it was there that he became a seaman, and he essentially worked his way up right through the ranks from a cabin boy to a sea captain. It became one of the best respected sea captains in the Americas.
In an unexpected twist, Knight discovered that when Captain Kidd sailed from London in February 1696, it was not as a pirate, but the very opposite, a pirate hunter, working for a consortium of wealthy English aristocrats and merchants. Britain's flourishing economy was largely built on trade with India. The ships of the British East India Company had been making huge profits, but the company had a growing problem: pirates. Disaster struck when English pirate Captain Avery teamed up with 5 other pirate captains to attack the Indian Mughal Emperor's convoy. They took a mammoth haul of over 500,000 gold and silver coins. The furious Mughal Emperor retaliated. His army attacked the company, and he threatened to put an end to English trade in India altogether. Captain William Kidd was commissioned by the British to hunt the pirates down. Not as an officer in the Royal Navy, but as a privateer.
A privateer is somebody who has a ship and a crew who gets a license, a letter of marque, to go out and hunt down the enemies of the state.
Kidd was given command of a newly built, powerful ship, the 34-gun Adventure Galley. So great was the crisis that Kidd's letter of marque, giving him permission to seize pirates, their ships, and their treasure in the King's name, was signed by King William III himself.
He was a well-respected, hard, experienced sea captain. He felt he had the skills and the ship and the expertise to pull this one off.
Kidd also had an added bonus. Britain was at war with France, so he could seize any enemy French ships he found. It was a confident Captain Kidd who set sail in the expectation that his share of the spoils would soon make him rich in captured ships and treasure. And the crew were also eager.
It was actually one of the best, most lucrative opportunities that these people had in the late 17th century.
The crew drew no pay. Their reward was a share of any ships and cargo taken, a system called no prey, no pay. Captain Kidd's 18-month privateer cruise was expected to pay from £500 to £3,500 per man, when the wage of a merchant seaman was just £45 a year.
An average seaman could actually make a small fortune from one good prize, one very lucrative prize. His normal cut would be enough to probably set himself up in business. He could buy a tavern, he could buy a farm, but essentially it was the big payload available to the late 17th century seaman.
As the Adventure Galley rounded the Horn of Africa, cannon at the ready, Kidd was expecting to encounter and conquer the pirates in their popular haunts off Madagascar and in the Indian Ocean. But there was a serious problem. They weren't there.
By the time he got to the Indian Ocean, all the ships he encountered were ones of allies, were English or Dutch ships. He couldn't find pirates, he couldn't find Frenchmen. So as the months rolled by and the crew weren't getting paid, things started to go badly wrong for him.
At the end of their planned 18-month cruise, not a single pirate ship or substantial French prize had been taken. The rebellious crew wanted to raid the next ship they came across, any ship. They wanted to turn pirate.
When the crew knew they only earned money by taking other ships, they tended to take ships that maybe they shouldn't have.
The Adventure Galley had been at sea for 2 years with little to show for it. The crew took to torturing prisoners to find cash aboard any ships they encountered. Damning accounts from southern African ports where these ships fled began to arrive in London and New York. Captain Kidd was labelled pirate, and that meant the death penalty at the end of a rope. Knight learned that to calm his mutinous crew, enrich his powerful backers in London and save his own skin, Kidd needed a miracle. One big ship, pirate or French, loaded to the guns. As if in answer to Kidd's prayers, a cry rang out from the masthead. A ship had been sighted, a large, heavily laden merchant ship.
In January 1698, he hit the jackpot. He found a ship called the Quetta Merchant, which contained a lot of valuable silks, gold jewellery. It was the motherlode. At last, he'd found the right ship.
The Quetta Merchant was no fighting pirate ship, but when her captain showed him French papers, Kidd could snap her up as a legitimate prize. The riches aboard the Quetta Merchant are well documented. On board were pounds of gold, silver and jewels, as well as bales of fine silk and opium. Valued at up to £400,000 at the time, over £60 million today. Kidd's hunt for treasure was over. Now he could return home to New York in triumph to remove the stain on his reputation that he had turned pirate. But what seemed to be Kidd's salvation turned out to be a disaster. In New York, Kidd was swiftly arrested. The Quetta Merchant was not French, but belonged to a powerful Indian trader. Captain Kidd, who had been sent pirate hunting to pacify the Indian Mughals, had instead made the situation much worse. After capturing their treasure ship, the Indian merchants were demanding Kidd's blood. The British government were determined to pacify the all-powerful Indian merchants and desperate to safeguard the lucrative Far East trade. To buy his freedom, Kidd told of a treasure chest he'd buried on a nearby island. When the governor of New York, Lord Bellamont, dug it up, he found £14,000 in gold and jewels, worth today £2 million. But it bought Kidd no reprieve. The Indian Emperor was baying for Kidd's blood, and the hapless Captain Kidd was shipped back to England to face trial for piracy and the hangman's rope.
This was no ordinary trial. This wasn't justice. This was retribution. His name was so blackened that everyone just thought, this man's a pirate.
Kidd's big mistake was to fail to copy the French pass he was given when he captured the Quetta Merchant. Without it, he couldn't prove that he had seized the ship legitimately. Now, at trial, when he needed it most, the French pass was nowhere to be seen.
The crucial piece of evidence, those French passes, which proved that he'd been behaving legitimately, had mysteriously disappeared. So he was essentially hung out to dry.
And Kidd faced not only a trial for piracy. Just to make sure he met the hangman, they also tried him for murder. In the darkest days of Kidd's voyage, when he was struggling to contain his rebellious crew's piratical exploits, a fatal incident occurred. The Adventure Galley encountered a Dutch ship, a British ally, and when Kidd refused to attack her, the crew were close to mutiny.
The gunner was the ringleader of a rather mutinous group of the crew who just wanted to capture it and ransack it, and that's when Kidd came to blows with the gunner.
Kidd, in his rage, grabbed an iron-bound wooden bucket and swung it at the argumentative gunner. The pail struck the gunner in the head, knocking him unconscious. Kidd had quelled the mutiny, but next day, the gunner died.
Killing a gunner is not a normal step for a sea captain, but in the instance of mutiny, those things are acceptable. And while Kidd knew he'd gone pretty far, he certainly didn't expect to be accused of murder for it.
In court, two of Kidd's former crew were given an amnesty to turn against him. They declared on oath that Kidd's fatal attack on the gunner had been premeditated murder.
The whole thing was just raced through so that they wanted a verdict, and they wanted one particular verdict, which is Kidd had to hang.
On the 9th of May 1701, Captain William Kidd was sentenced to be hanged. In a desperate attempt to escape his fate, he played what he hoped was a trump card. From his cell in Newgate Jail, he wrote a pleading letter to the government bargaining for his life.
I do most humbly pray that you will be pleased to represent to the Honourable House of Commons that in my late proceedings in the Indies I have lodged goods and treasure to the value of £100,000, which I desire the government may have the benefit of.
Kidd was claiming he'd hidden a second, much greater treasure, what would now be worth £15 million, and that if they would spare his life, he would lead them to it.
That's the germ that's sparked the interest of a lot of sort of treasure hunters ever since.
It was in this letter that the legend of Captain Kidd's vast buried treasure was born. So certain was Kidd about the hoard, he made it clear that they should hang him if he did not deliver.
If I fail therein, I desire no favour, but to be forthwith executed according to my sentence. Sir, your unfortunate humble servant, William Kidd.
The government, however, stood to lose a far greater sum than £15 million. All trade with India. It did not take the bait. The Indian moguls had to be appeased with Kidd's very public death. Under the rules of the Admiralty, Captain Kidd was taken onto the Thames foreshore at Wapping, London, between the low tide and the high water mark, to be hanged. But his execution did not go smoothly. When he was turned off the ladder, the rope snapped.
He must have thought he's actually had the first lucky break he's had for about 6 years, where often that's seen as a legitimate reprieve. In Kidd's case, he was just marched back up onto the scaffold, a new rope was found, and he was shoved off into oblivion.
The Admiralty, however, did not consider merely hanging pirates enough of a deterrent. Kidd's body was chained to a post in the Thames until the tide had washed over it 3 times. The body, painted with pitch, hung for over 2 years in a gibbet by the Thames estuary as a warning to passing sailors not to turn pirate. But the legend of Kidd's treasure would never die. Almost 300 years later, in Santa Monica, on the coast of Southern California, Richard Knight was hooked by the mystery of where Kidd's treasure lay buried. And he was determined to find it. Knight launched his treasure quest from the University of California, Los Angeles Library. From that moment on, his life was changed forever.
He got this idea, this obsession in his mind, and from then on he focused on it. Rich was a fairly rare character in that he really wasn't interested in money. He talks about the value of Kidd's treasure and being millions and countless millions, but I think it was the attraction of the adventure to him.
As Knight investigated, he found that others had dreamed of finding Kidd's treasure. And like them, he discovered that Kidd had left behind a trail of clues. Kidd's treasure trail starts in 1929 on the south coast of England in Eastbourne. It was the hometown of middle-aged bachelor Hubert Palmer. He was a retired solicitor who loved to collect pirate relics.
One day in 1929, he came in possession of an old oak bureau that was reputedly once belonged to Captain Kidd. And it had a brass plate attached to the front, William Kidd, Adventure Galley, 1696.
Whilst writing at the bureau one day, Palmer must have leant on it a little more than usual. One of the supporting runners broke off.
When Palmer examined it, he saw on the end, in wax, a very small impression of an anchor. He guessed something must be inside this runner, so he carefully took the wax imprint from the end, and inside he found a brass tube.
Knight discovered that Palmer had found wrapped around the brass tube a parchment. It was a map, a treasure map. On it, X marked the spot, just as in the story Treasure Island. But there was more. At the top were the words China Sea, on the left a compass north bearing, and at the bottom Kidd's initials, WK.
Palmer immediately suspected that this possibly was the hiding place of Kidd's treasure. But of course, there was nothing on the chart to say where it was.
Far from telling Knight where Kidd's treasure was, Palmer's chart left him with a fascinating glimpse of a mystery. His head buzzed with questions of how to solve it. Fortunately, in the 1930s, Hubert Palmer had uncovered more clues.
After that, Palmer devoted a lot of his time and energies to advertising for anything to do with Kidd, any relics, any chests, boxes, anything, hoping to find further evidence of where this island might be.
Knight learned that Palmer advertised for any objects belonging to Kidd, and slowly he found them.
3 years after Palmer found the oak bureau, he was offered this chest.
The chest came from a nautical man, Captain Morgan, who claimed descent from notorious buccaneer Sir Henry Morgan. Another of his light-fingered ancestors had been jailer at Newgate Prison, and when Kidd was hanged, the jailer took the chest.
He could see inlaid in brass on the top of the lid a skull and crossbones and the letter K. On opening the chest, he was amazed to see inside, attached to a false bottom, a plaster cast skull fixed to a plaster cast Bible. It is believed the skull was there for the crew to swear allegiance to the captain or the crown, hand on the skull with the Bible in the hand.
Disappointingly, the false bottom was empty, but there was something else mysterious there. When Palmer turned the board over, he discovered a mirror. What was it doing there?
Palmer examined the beading around here and discovered that this particular part of the beading quite easily came off. He was then able to slide the mirror and out like that. And lo and behold, to his great excitement, there was another chart.
Knight, just like Palmer, was excited by the fact that the outline of this chart was almost identical to the first one, but it contained more information.
5 0.15 southeast by 50 north, 36 northeast, 36 northeast rocks, 3 feet by 3 feet by 4.
Knight now became convinced these were directions to the treasure. But apart from the clue China Sea, he had no idea of the island's whereabouts. No latitude or longitude. He needed more. Fortunately for Knight, Palmer had another piece of extraordinary good luck. When 2 years later, he was able to buy a chest that once belonged to Captain Kidd's wife, Sarah.
This is known as Sarah Kidd's workbox. There is an inlaid brass plate on the top which says William and Sarah Kidd, their box, 1699.
Meticulous as always, Palmer measured the box inside and out. There was a discrepancy, leading him to suspect a secret compartment in the base.
Palmer discovered on the ends that there were 2 or 3 hidden nails or screws disguised in there. He eventually managed to undo these and work this beading edge off, and this revealed the hidden compartment underneath. He probed inside and discovered a parchment showing another chart.
This chart was more detailed. Knight first tried to decipher what had to be Kidd's own writing around the map's edge. After much puzzling, he had it.
360 yards, veer right, north, 3 stumps, 87 feet from the centre of triangle in left rocks, 98, 20 feet east of skeleton of Lieb.
The final word remained a mystery, but Knight knew these were more detailed instructions of where to find the buried treasure. Crucially, this chart showed latitude and longitude. Knight now had what he needed, a way to pinpoint the island itself. But there was a snag. The longitude was hard to read. If the longitude was read as 3130 east, that put the island in the Sudan. Perhaps the mark before 31 could be a figure 1. But 131.30 east put the island 200 miles off the Philippines in open ocean. Knight realized there was a fundamental problem with the longitude. The modern maps Knight examined used the International Zero Meridian passing through the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, London. But then he realized charts in Captain Kidd's time referenced other zero meridians. The French favoured Paris, the Spanish Cadiz. The high mountain of Tenerife was also popular with seafarers. The longitude of the treasure island would depend on which chart Kidd had been using.
So when looking at a chart of the 17th century or earlier, you had to know what meridian was in use at that time. And that's one of the problems with these charts. What meridian did Kidd use?
Richard Knight began to study atlases from the 16th to the 18th century. They were beautiful and ornate, and none recorded longitude from the zero meridian at Greenwich. Knight applied the Kidd treasure map longitudes. The first, 3130 East, put the island in Nigeria. No good at all. But the second longitude, 13130 East, indicated the island lay somewhere between Burma and the Philippines. That meant the South China Sea. This was more like it. China Sea, just as on the Kidd treasure maps.
Slowly he put together this idea that he had solved the mystery that nobody else had.
Knight now consulted chart after chart, scanning thousands of islands, looking for an island that matched the old parchments. Then, at last, on French Admiralty Hydrographic Chart number 3686 of 1879, there it was. Hon-Tre-Lon. Right shape, right orientation, right name. Hon-Tre-Lon is called in English Grand Pirate Island. But it was right in the worst possible spot imaginable. Hon-Tre-Lon was in the territorial waters of a country which, after a long, bitter war with the USA, was hostile to Westerners. Communist Vietnam.
Nobody had looked there because of the Vietnam War, because they were communist, because the politics had changed. It wasn't a place where you did pitch up and suddenly look for treasure. So he decided that he was the person who was going to brave all the odds and go and prove to the world that his theory was right.
International treasure hunting is an expensive business. Knight, looking to fund his expedition to Kidd's forbidden treasure island, set out his stall in Sydney, Australia. Using all his skills as an entertainer and storyteller, he tried to lure wealthy Australian businessmen into his romantic quest.
Of course, he was always on the lookout for a backer who might help. So, he used to pick up these extraordinary figures, go off with them, trying to persuade them that to come in with him to this sort of madcap mission.
Slowly, Richard Knight managed to draw together a small group to buy into his dreams of treasure. But his charm would never convince the Vietnamese government to let him go on a treasure hunt. He would need a cover story. To explain his need for a metal detector without arousing suspicion, Knight and his backers decided to write asking for official permission to prospect for minerals. On a business letter headed the Australian Pacific Geological and Mining Company, they made their pitch, ending,
hoping we may have your favourable consideration for this application, as we believe that it may have considerable interest and potential benefit to the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
It didn't work. There was no reply from the Vietnamese. Knight decided through a travel agent to simply ask to visit Hon-Tre-Lon as a tourist. This time he did get a reply, but it exactly followed the Communist Party line.
We regret the areas you have stipulated in your request are not now possible to visit. Only published areas through our approved agency in Australia are possible.
The political climate of the Cold War left no legitimate way for Richard Knight to get to Hon-Tre-Lon. Gradually, his backers backed away.
And so he was now left on his own. And all his backers dropped out. And rather than say, well, I'm not going to do this until I've got it properly organised, he thought, well, what the hell? I'm going to do it myself.
By June 1981, Richard Knight had decided that the only way to reach his treasure island was to mount an illegal expedition. The first step of his personal invasion was to get as close to Vietnam as he could. He decided to base himself in Bangkok, Thailand. But this was still over 300 miles by sea from Hon-Tre-Lon, a very dangerous voyage. Finding a boat for hire that was large enough but inconspicuous enough to sneak him within striking distance of Hontrelon would be tricky. On top of that, he had to find a willing crew.
I think Rich found it difficult to persuade totally legitimate, solid citizens to go in with him because of his nonchalant character, his habit of whizzing off and disappearing, or not being totally practical, perhaps, or they came to that view. And so he was thrust on unusual characters like himself.
Knight now took a leaf out of Captain Kidd's book, offering a share of the treasure. But still, he could induce no one to volunteer for such a risky voyage. Then a friend introduced him to a fresh-faced 18-year-old American, Fred Graham.
But in the end he found, the perfect person, really, a young photojournalist who also wanted an adventure.
Fred Graham had left home in California with a new camera to become a war photographer. But with no experience, he couldn't break into the profession. He was at a dead end, and Richard Knight's treasure hunt offered just the kind of excitement he was looking for. Knight offered him 15% of the treasure. Graham negotiated his share up to 40%. They had a deal. But just like Kidd's crew, if they found no treasure, he would get nothing. The decision to go with Knight would cost him dear. Just 2 days later, towards the end of May 1983, Knight and Graham were in high spirits as they set their bow into the Gulf of Thailand. Knight had persuaded a local crew to accept his bizarre charter, and they were off on their adventure to unearth the legendary treasure of Captain Kidd. It took several days and nights to reach the island Knight had picked out from the old charts. But fortune seemed to smile on the voyage. The Gulf was the haunt of real 20th century cutthroat pirates. Knight and Graham were well equipped for treasure hunting with a metal detector and digging equipment, but not for rappelling boarders. But they passed through without incident. After days at sea, Knight and Graham landed on their treasure island. Knight's crazy plan seemed to be working rather well. All was quiet, and Knight decided that they would wait until first light to unearth the legendary treasure of Captain Kidd. It had, after all, waited almost 300 years. It could surely wait one more night. But what he didn't know was, they'd been seen. The Vietnamese had endless questions to fire at Richard Knight. Who are you? Where are you from? What is this equipment for? Any answers to do with treasure hunting were met with scorn. They were convinced he was an American spy working for the Western imperialist CIA. Knight and Graham were imprisoned in rat and cockroach-infested cells, separated in solitary confinement. If Knight couldn't overturn the spy story, he faced a similar fate to Captain Kidd: execution. Again and again he was interrogated. Again and again he had another confession to sign. What he told them of his globe-trotting acting career was to them an elaborate cover story. What is all this equipment for? Who, they kept asking him, was his contact in the British government? Richard Knight didn't have a contact in the British government. He wished he had. Not a soul even knew he was missing, let alone where he was and the danger he was in. Captain Kidd at least had treasure to bargain with. Knight had nothing. More than once, when the militia took him from his cell, Knight believed that he was to be shot.
I think he weathered jail quite well. He had all sorts of diversionary tactics to fall back on.
He took to playing imaginary games of golf, reliving visits to Blackpool, analysing gambling systems and besting imaginary opponents with a homemade pack of cards.
He could always find something within himself to withstand those long, solitary and potentially dangerous situations, largely because there's a huge imagination, I think.
But as month after month passed, Knight fought for his sanity. He gave each corner of the cell a function, one to look to the future, another to look to the past, one for prayer, another for comedy. But after 4 months with no contact from either the British or US governments, it seemed he might never get out alive. But he was unaware there was one faint hope. Just before the ill-fated treasure hunt, young Fred Graham had wisely arranged for a letter to be posted to his father if he wasn't back in 30 days. He wrote,
"If you're reading this letter, something has gone very wrong. Either I am dead or in prison."
Graham's letter saved them both. With the news that Knight and Graham had gone to Vietnam, the British and US embassies launched investigations. The Minister of State at the Foreign Office, Richard Luce, also the Knight's local MP, wrote to Knight's mother.
You can rest assured that the embassy will continue to press the Vietnamese to let them know where your son is being held.
The diplomatic activity worked. The Vietnamese admitted they had arrested Knight and Graham for violating the territory of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and they were in prison. But now, the Vietnamese played pirate, demanding a ransom of $10,000 per man. But neither the US nor the British government would pay a penny.
The British government would not pay a ransom, would they? They don't pay official ransoms. They always make a thing of, we don't pay, otherwise it just happens again.
By the 17th of May 1984, Fred Graham was free and returned to America, 40 pounds lighter than when he had left home on his adventures. His family and friends in California had raised the money, limiting his captivity to less than a year. The unfortunate Richard Knight stayed in jail. The British Vice Consul in Hanoi wrote to Knight,
"I know that Frederick Graham's departure must have left you feeling depressed, but please be assured your mother and friends are still working hard to raise the money to pay your fine."
After over a year in captivity, they'd raised only $2,000, still $8,000 short. Knight waited in prison alone through June and July. But then in August, the British consul wrote to tell him he'd had an extraordinary stroke of luck.
A particularly generous offer from a British citizen living in California means that the balance of the fine is now available.
In early August 1984, Richard Knight received the greatest treasure of all. His freedom. In the years that followed, Fred Graham's thirst for adventure remained unquenched. He succeeded in working as a photojournalist, and also, ironically, for the CIA during the US war in El Salvador. Now, he is an author of political thrillers. But Richard Knight never stopped looking for the treasure.
He doesn't seem to have regretted having done this, or having done it in this harebrained way. And he never lost the dream. I know he didn't lose the dream because, you know, when I last said goodbye to him, he was off back to China to find a backer to go and pick up the treasure.
Knight, stranded in China, out of funds and out of luck, telephoned a stranger for help, fellow treasure hunter George Edmonds.
Well, what could I do? I mean, he needed money to get out. So I agreed to send him some money if he agreed to tell me the true story. And I said, "Have you really found it, Richard?" And he said, "Yes, I have."
Edmonds never saw Knight or his money again. Richard Knight died in Carlisle in the north of England in 2002. So what is the truth of Kidd's legendary treasure? There's no doubt that he did bury a chest containing £14,000 that was dug up at the time on the orders of Lord Bellamont, Governor of New York. But what of Kidd's claim to have had a further £100,000 hidden away?
The question is, of course, was Kidd 100% truthful about how much shiny gold and jewellery he actually found and hid?
Did Captain Kidd really intend to guide a ship to a vast buried hoard? Or was the treasure a last desperate bid for his life? Did he intend, once at sea, to pull off a daring escape?
I'd be very surprised if any treasure is found, any of Kidd's treasure ever comes to light. I think Lord Belmont basically managed to get his hands on the entire haul.
Nothing, it seems, puts off a dedicated treasure hunter. For George Edmonds, this dark cloud still has the glint of a silver lining. He believes he has properly deciphered the Kidd treasure maps.
The charts do lead to a treasure, but it is nothing whatsoever to do with Kidd.
Edmonds believes he has located a new treasure island where no treasure hunters have been before, just like Richard Knight, just like every serious treasure hunter. George Edmonds plays his cards very close to his chest while he seeks backers for his expedition.
I can't tell you where this island is because it is the result of 8 years of intensive research. Everything is in there. The solution of the clues on the charts, and where this other island is, what the treasure is, and where it is.
It seems that dreams of buried treasure never die.
So it's still out there. I'm very confident of that.